Hi, everyone. I'm Jess, and I'm going to be the lecturer for today on data ethics. And throughout this lecture, it's going to be a lot of me talking at you, but also a lot of us discussing and sort of ideating together. So we'll be using a few different Zoom features. Feel free to be active in the chat if you have a thought that comes up or a reflection that comes up. And we'll also be using the raise hand feature on Zoom so we can indicate how everyone is feeling about certain things for some questions. So we're going to go ahead and start using the raise hand feature now, just so we can practice it. And just in case anyone hasn't used that feature on Zoom before. So go ahead and use the Zoom raise hand feature if you have heard of data ethics before, if this is something that you're at least maybe subtly familiar with. You don't have to be an expert in it by any means. Okay. Great. So it seems like at least half, if not more than half. That's really awesome. Amazing. So yeah, feel free to lower your hand now. There should be like a lower hand button that you can push, and then it takes everyone back down to no hands up. And that's sort of the gist of whenever I say like raise your hand if, that'll be the process. Like raise your hand, leave it up for maybe like 30 seconds and then lower it after. And that's awesome that everyone's familiar for the most part with data ethics. And for those of you who aren't, we will definitely be going over the basics today. For those of you who are, we will be getting into the nitty-gritty. So this will not be repeating things that you already know, although some of it you might have heard before. And for Finlay, who was trying to find the raise hand button, I think it should be next to the emojis or reactions in the bottom bar. There should be some sort of like raise hand button, but let me know if you still can't find it later. So before we get into the meat of data ethics, I'm going to quickly introduce myself, and I want to make sure that the slides are advancing for you all. Sometimes they were having difficulty with this before. So someone give me a thumbs up if the slides are actually advancing for you all today. Okay, cool. Thank you. So I'm Jess or Jessie. I go by both names, and I'm currently getting my PhD. I'm a fourth-year PhD student at the University of Colorado in Colorado Boulder, USA. So it's bright and early for me, a nice ripe 5 a.m. So bear with me as my brain wakes up this morning. I got my coffee in front of me. I've also had a lot of industry experience doing work with machine learning ethics, AI ethics, and specifically on what's called operationalizing fairness in machine learning. And I've done this with a few different large tech companies throughout my time as a grad student. So I can speak a lot to what it's like doing this kind of work on the ground in an industry setting and also in a research setting. And the two are unfortunately a little bit different, but slowly becoming more and more related. And also machine learning and data science ethics and AI ethics are very, very closely linked to data ethics, because data is often almost always used to feed these complex machine learning systems. So doing data ethics work often becomes machine learning ethics work, and the other way around as well. So today we are going to be going through quite a few different things. We'll begin with the why. I want to spark some motivation in all of you and go through a bit of a history of data and data ethics. And then we'll go through the basics, some foundational principles, some reasons why data ethics can help with business incentives. And we're going to actually skip the ethics cycle today, most likely, because we discovered yesterday that there's not enough time for that. So that'll be in the case study in part 2 next week. And then we will go through some fun case studies to close out the lecture today, just because that it's always fascinating to see what's happening in the real world surrounding data ethics, both the good and the bad. And we'll have discussions throughout different modules that I'm going through today. So beginning at the beginning, we're going to discuss some motivation for why data ethics is so pressing and important right now. And before we can get into data ethics, I'm going to give a little bit of a brief history on just data generally. So I'm curious how many of you have heard of some of these things. So data, the concept of data obviously existed far before 1884. Data has been created and collected in numerous ways for longer than I'm sure many of us even know or realize or can document. And when I say like the beginning of data, what I really mean is the beginning of digitally collecting and using data. And so this like digitization began really in 1884 when Herman Hollerith invented what was called the punch card tabulating machine. And it looks kind of like an old-fashioned telegraph machine in a way, but this was sort of like an abacus, calculator, computer combined. And this was used to process data from the 1890 US Census. And in 1911, just about 20 years later, this same person, Herman, founded what eventually became IBM. So this is the beginning of also like the computing technology phase. And then not too long after, in the 1940s, we start to see what are called huge computer rooms. And this is not a computer lab full of computers. It is one room full of one large computer. And there's a bunch of inputs and outputs, like you can see in this photo. And this sort of set the precedent for what are large data server rooms. And you can see there's a little bit of similarity in this image as well. Also, something that I love to point out too about these photos is if you Google huge computer rooms, you'll see that a lot of the people in these photos are women, because around this time, it was actually more the norm that women were computer scientists, more so than men, which I find very fascinating. And there's a lot of historical reasons why that was. And unfortunately is not as much the case today. And now we're going to fast forward quite a bit to 2006. We have Google CEO Eric Schmidt using the term cloud computing at an industry conference. And Eric did not coin the term cloud computing. It had already been used in academic disciplines and in industry settings throughout like the 90s. But this was the first time it was said in a really large audience setting. And it was the first time that it really caught on. And this is also sort of a nexus point when we see that there's this decoupling from us thinking that data is something that exists in the real world, that is this tangible thing, to, oh, data is this ephemeral thing that is intangible and just sort of exists in the cloud around us. So we're sort of unintentionally removing ourselves from this concept of data, and we're no longer thinking of it as linked intrinsically to humans and people, but that it is instead just sort of this thing that's floating around us. And that began to happen more and more as services like AWS started to crop up and as giant data centers started to form. So this is an example of, in 2013, what a server room might look like. And at this point in time, the estimated total amount of data in the world was 4.4 zettabytes, which is pretty wild to think about. So this is 10 years ago, and we have about 4.4 billion terabytes. And I gave this example yesterday because I had this handy, but this is my little external hard drive that's 2 terabytes. And this is pretty advanced technology. I remember like not too long ago, 2 terabyte hard drives would have been significantly larger. And so we've got like 2.2 billion of these 10 years ago to account for all of the data in the world. And server rooms are also getting fancier at this point. So throughout this time in the 2010s, as data is progressing and as we're using it and collecting it and curating it more, there's also some scandals that are beginning to happen because people are realizing, oh, data is the new oil. That's the term that was used, at least. And people are also seeing data as this like almost form of currency because it's something that we can now make money off of and exploit for our own benefits. And that's exactly what happened in the Cambridge Analytica scandal. which I'll get into it a little bit more in detail later. But at a high level, I'm sure many of you have heard of this before. What happened was data was collected non-consensually on so many people, and they performed psychological profiling and targeted political advertising on so many people, and it really influenced some important political elections. Ended up becoming a very, very big deal and was definitely illegal. So Cambridge Analytica was not the first scandal of this kind. It was just one of the first major scandals that really made news. And in response to scandals like this, we started to see certain regulations come out to try to prevent these things from happening in the future. So, for example, we have the GDPR, which I'm almost positive all of you have heard of this living in the EU, because the GDPR really was created in part in response to Cambridge Analytica specifically. It was already underway before then, but the Cambridge Analytica really acted as a catalyst for this kind of regulation to try to preserve things like privacy and to try to promote things like consent. And we'll do a deep dive on the GDPR in about 2 modules. So wait just a moment for that if you don't know the nitty-gritty of GDPR. So now fast forward to today. We're in 2023. And now the total estimated amount of data in the world that is being both collected and created is about 79 zettabytes. So that is about, let's see, maybe 30, roughly almost 40 of these, 40 billion of these that exist in the world. And that's increasing every day. So you can see just 10 years ago, we have 18 times more data than we had 10 years ago, which means that our data expansion is increasing at an exponential rate. That's a lot of data. And so with all of this data and all of the potential repercussions of this data, that brings us to a need for something like data ethics. And this is because we consume and create more data than ever before. And so part of this motivation for the need for data ethics comes from 3 sort of pillars that result as a consequence of this proliferation of data, if you will. So these 3 pillars are titled volume, variety, and velocity. And so volume is what I just went over. Data is now collected at an unprecedented scale. So another stat for you all is there's 2.5 quintillion bytes of data created daily. Quintillion almost doesn't even sound like a real word. That's so much data. And not only do we have this volume, this massive volume of data, but we also have a variety of data. So variety is about how we're not just collecting data on, for example, people's names and addresses, but we are collecting data on almost every facet of life where data can be collected at this point. So imagine now you have your device, your phone, that is recording your location data, your search history, your social media likes, your watch history, your photos, your phone calls, your social network friends, your workout history, and it's connected to your bank. And this is only just a few examples. And all of those different kinds of data can be combined to make inferences and assumptions about who we are and to make decisions about the things that we deserve. So it's one thing to have access to any of those pieces of data individually, but to now combine them all, it threatens what's called contextual integrity. And for those of you who have not heard of contextual integrity, this was a phrase coined by Helen Nissenbaum, who basically described it as when data is collected for a certain purpose and then used for a different purpose or interpreted for a different purpose. And because of that, the context gets lost. So one example of this would be if, let's say, like you see a political candidate give a speech and then somebody takes just one brief snippet of their speech and out of context makes that candidate sound like they said something really bad. But if you had heard the sentence they said before or the sentence they said after, you would have realized, oh, it's actually totally fine what they said. But that's contextual collapse or threatening contextual integrity, because we no longer know the context that one piece of data came from. And this is now true when you take data from ourselves and you combine it and manipulate it in different ways. It loses its own context, and that can cause a lot of harms, as we'll see throughout this lecture. And then this third pillar is velocity. So data is not only being collected at an unprecedented scale, but it's also being processed at an unprecedented scale. And this is due in part because of algorithmic advances like machine learning capacity to process data more quickly, but it's also happening in part because of hardware advances, because now we have things like this tiny little external hard drive, which can process data super quickly, whereas in the past, we would have all had to share one of those large computer rooms. So the combination of these 3 V's really continues to incite motivation for why this is important, this meaning data ethics. And so I don't want to just scare you all away, because there's obviously some great consequences to having access to so much data and the ability to process so much data. And one of the biggest benefits happens in the medical field, where we've been able to do things like improve our medical diagnoses, help detect cancer, and use robotics to help with surgeries in a medical setting as well, at a rate and an accuracy level that's far beyond what humans have been capable of doing. And then beyond the medical field, we also have a lot of great advances in business through the recent creation of recommender systems. And recommender systems can help businesses find their target audiences. They can help with user satisfaction and efficiency and user experience. And so those have really improved our digital lives and our digital experiences. And then we also have another high level pro to using data more widely, and that is that it helps us understand the planet that we live on much more. It helps us improve things like climate change, or to make predictions about how to make things more environmentally sustainable, or just to understand and predict what might happen in the future because of certain natural disasters or things like that. And then finally, we have the ability to understand ourselves more as well. So there's a lot of ways that we can track our own personal lives through our personal informatics and data. And we can do this to improve our health. We can do it to improve our habits. We can also do it to make our habits worse, but I'll leave that for the next slide. And then there's also things like mental health interventions, like predicting if someone is likely to commit suicide on Facebook, for example, and then intervening if it's detected that they might need some help. So there's a lot of really powerful ways that data is being used that can benefit humans, and that is absolutely wonderful. But where data ethics comes into play is that it's not always good. There are ways in which data is used to harm or manipulate or exploit us rather than augment us. And a lot of these harms or potential harms come from these power imbalances that happen because people who have access to data and the ability to collect and process it often have more power than the people who originally created the data in the first place. And I actually do have a quick question for you all, like a brief poll, because I think this is a tension that I have experienced from some of my colleagues. Some people think that data that is collected from us never belonged to us. We just offered it to these platforms. And so they have the right to manipulate it, to exploit it, to use it in whatever ways they want, as long as we consented to giving them the data. And other people think that when we give data, or when we provide data, since that data is a reflection of us and it comes from us, we own that data and it belongs to us, even if we're giving permission to people to use it. So there is almost this tension of ownership. And I'm wondering, maybe like quick raise of hands, if you think that the data that you create belongs to you. So raise your hand if you think that you own your data. Okay. Interesting. We've got roughly half of everyone in this Zoom room believes that. Wow, we're almost perfectly evenly split. Fascinating. Feel free to put in the chat your reasoning why you may or may not think that you own your own data, like Sam, who believes that they are just using it, not owning it. Yeah, this is fascinating and good food for thought. So beyond power dynamics and these questions of who actually owns the data in the first place, we also have issues of discrimination and bias that happen. And these are probably the most infamous examples. These get the most media attention. And so the idea here is just that since data is a reflection of where it came from, data will reflect the social biases and inequalities and discrimination that exists in society. And so it perpetuates discrimination and bias and sometimes amplifies it when it's used in technological systems. And then this third sort of hard tenet is exclusion. And this one is often not discussed when it comes to data ethics or unethics. And this is because data is often used in really high stakes decision-making contexts nowadays, which means that it can be used for some really important decisions to give people access to, for example, like social welfare resources. But when it is possibly biased or discriminatory, it can be really dangerous when it systematically excludes, for example, certain demographic groups over others at no fault of their own, and without any ability to know that this is happening because there's a lack of transparency. So all that to be said, in 2023, we're sitting in not a terrible spot. There's actually quite a few research disciplines and conferences that have started to focus specifically on issues like data ethics, and it's becoming increasingly popular to research and to better. And this is in large part in response to some scandals that have been happening in the last decade or so. But that being said, there's still a long way to go. And so this is why it's really important for people like all of you who are training to become data scientists or data workers in some way, that that data ethics is something that you not only know and think of as this thing that has to be complied with, but also that it's something that you genuinely feel passionate about, or at the very least, you understand why it's important and can then feel motivated to incorporate it into your work in the future. So now we're going to get into the basics, now that I've hopefully sufficiently motivated you all for why it's important that we're here today. So data ethics at a high level, for those of you who did not raise your hand earlier and are not familiar with the topic, it is a new branch of ethics that studies and evaluates moral problems related to data, algorithms, and corresponding practices in order to formulate and support morally good solutions. And the basic concepts of data ethics are, first, data comes from people more often than not. And because of this, data are people. They are the same. And so as a data worker, we have a responsibility to those people, and we have a duty almost to those people. So some of the questions that are asked in data ethics work are, how is data being collected? How is data being used? How is data being shared? And what are the repercussions of the answers to all of those questions? We can utilize data ethics throughout any part of the data pipeline, and probably even before, after, and within parts of the data pipeline. And by data pipeline, what I mean when I say that is beginning with data collection, through data curation, to data annotation, and eventually to data use. And many of you are probably familiar with a lot of these concepts. So I'm going to quickly describe them and then go over some questions that we might ask at each of these different stages. So beginning with data collection, this has a lot to do with the questions that we might ask around data collection are around how much consent we are getting from the people who the data is being collected by. And so a lot of the questions that we ask around data collection are in line with the questions that we might ask on an institutional review board or an IRB form, if any of you have ever filled out one of those. And I know someone yesterday said that there's a different name for an IRB in Europe, if anyone feels like putting that in the chat, if you know what that is. But maybe give like a quick thumbs up or a hand raise if you've ever gone through an IRB process before, because some of you might be very familiar with this process. Wow, okay. One person has gone through an IRB before. Interesting. Well, maybe then this is new. So usually at an institution like an academic university, if you ever want to conduct research, you have to go through an IRB process, which basically means describing what data you're going to collect and why and what you're going to do with that data. And this was created because of what were called the Tuskegee experiments. I don't remember when, maybe the beginning of the 1900s, where they were performing tests on people with syphilis, and they ended up really harming a lot of research participants. And the research participants were majority Black people. And it was just really, really harmful study all around, very racist. And there were no research ethics protocols in place. So the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, now oversees whenever people are trying to do research with data. And we can learn from different institutional boards like the IRB whenever we work with data now too, because they've already done a lot of the work for us to come up with best practices. And part of those best practices are asking for consent in the first place to make sure that people are okay with their data being collected. And also asking if this data collection will benefit those people, or if there's any regulations that we need to abide by. And then the second question here is, well, what data is being collected? Is it actually necessary to collect this information? And is it going to be used now, or maybe possibly theoretically in the future? Do we actually need to collect this data and store it right now? And then speaking of data storage, that's sort of the final question here is, how is the data going to be stored? If it's personally identifiable information or PII data, does it need to be encrypted, or do we need to limit our data scientists' access to this data? Can you share this information with users, or does it need to be kept private from them as well? There's a lot of questions here surrounding storage and how to keep this data private. And then the next step of the data pipeline is data curation. And so data curation is the process of creating, organizing, and maintaining data sets so that they can be accessed and used by the people who are looking for whatever information from them. And this involves structuring, indexing, and cataloging data for users in an organization or a group or the general public. And I think that what happens a lot with computer scientists and data scientists, at least in my experience, I'm a trained computer scientist, is I feel like we're given a data set and we often make the assumption that that data set can be seen as this ground truth, or that everything in the data set perfectly reflects the system and the context in which that data was collected. And this is more often than not the case. As a data scientist or as an engineer, or just as a data worker, there are so many assumptions that go into the creation and the curation of a data set. And so examples of this are our, if maybe we're collecting gender labels for a data set, are we only allowing gender to be categorized as a binary as opposed to maybe more of a continuous or non-binary scale? And then also, when we're making these assumptions, how are we representing the world through these assumptions? Maybe even just in the choice of how we label the columns in our data set, that could have a lot of repercussions for people. Like if we're maybe trying to curate and categorize data about race and ethnicity as categories that are mutually exclusive, when in reality, those categories are often blended because of intersectional identities. And also race and ethnicity are often context dependent and culturally defined. And so these are just examples of small assumptions that are often made and taken for granted. And we don't realize often that those actually have really big repercussions down the line, when all we did was make a simple decision about whether our variables were discrete or continuous, or what to name our column in our data set. And I have a discussion question for all of you here, because there's definitely a little bit of tension as well along these lines of like the assumptions that we make with data, and how those assumptions might represent the world. And some people think that data is objective always. Some people think that data is objective sometimes, like it's possible for data to be objective, but it's not always. And some people think that data is always subjective. It is never objective. The next stage in the data pipeline past data curation is data annotation. And data annotation does not always happen. If we're looking at continuous discrete variables, for example, like numerical data, there's rarely data annotation involved in that process. But more often than not, data annotation happens when we have to make inferences in order to create large data sets with labels, or whenever we're working with categorical data, for example. This happens a lot. And data annotation almost always happens when we're doing or working with data that has to do with humans. So annotation is the process of labeling data with relevant tags to make it easier for computers to understand and interpret. And this data can be in the form of images, text, audio, or video, and data annotators, real people, need to label it as accurately as possible. So data annotation is something that is often dismissed or forgotten in the data pipeline process. Typically, especially as like data scientists, we'll be given a data set with labels. And I know, at least for me personally, I'll rarely ask, where did those labels come from? And can I even trust them? And even beyond that, I'll rarely ask, who made these labels? Who did the work to put the tags and the labels into this data set? And this question of who is doing that annotation work is a question of what's called ghost work. And there is this book that was written by Mary L. Gray and Siddharth Suri. The book is called Ghost Work: How to Stop Silicon Valley from Building a New Global Underclass. And for those of you who have not heard of this book, I would highly recommend. It's a very fascinating read. And the idea is that there is just so many hidden labor practices that are really kept secret and unknown to the world about how these large scale data sets are created. And this could happen a lot of times on platforms like Mechanical Turk, where workers are being paid in countries where the value of the dollar is significantly lower than like the euro or the US dollar, for example. And these hidden labor costs are actually really extreme, where workers will be, or this annotation work will be outsourced to people who are getting paid maybe pennies or just cents every dollar, as opposed to the people in, for example, Silicon Valley, who might get paid hundreds of dollars per hour for doing the same work. And this work is not enjoyable often. It's not only like tedious, but it's also emotionally and mentally draining, because often the kinds of labels that people are having to place on these data sets are, is this image too graphic to present to people? Or is there something not safe for work in this image? Or is this image offensive to people? And so there's this like mental and emotional strain that happens with data annotation work, where people spend, 10 hours a day looking at super graphic images, labeling whether or not they're actually graphic, and and then they're getting paid just a dollar or less to do that all day. So there's a lot of ethical considerations to be made about like who is actually doing this work in the first place, and is it okay to ask people to do this kind of work? And then beyond the hidden labor, we actually have the result of this work, which is the annotations and the labels themselves. And so the annotations and the labels are obviously created by humans, and they involve making a lot of inferences about the data that they are labeling. And so some questions that we can ask here is, well, are we attempting to make labels based on inferences that we're making, or assumptions that we're making, or biases that we hold? And an example of this would be if you ask someone to maybe take in an image of a person and then make an inference about what their emotions are based on their facial expressions. Or maybe you take an image of a person and you are asked to make inferences about what their ethnicity or their racial identity is, just solely based on their physical appearance. And both of these things I have actually personally seen happen within industry and seen as the status quo and not critically questioned. So this is not something that's like Orwellian, dystopic, this could happen in the future. This is actively happening and probably being used on devices that we are using every single day. And so we have to ask, where might bias enter this data annotation and labeling process, and how might that negatively impact certain people over others? And then now that we, no longer trust our labels and our annotations, well, the next set of questions is about, well, how can we begin to trust them more? How can we audit these labels? Can we take this ground truth tagging or labeling as something that we can trust to train our machine learning models? Or do we have to critically question now our evaluation metrics? And whenever we thought that our model was accurate because it was predicting these perceivably ground truth labels, was it actually as accurate as we thought it was? And so there's a lot of unanswered questions here around how to actually trust our labels and use them to further whatever technologies that the data is being used for. So data annotation is very, very fascinating. And if anybody has more questions or thoughts about that, feel free to put them in the chat, because I have many thoughts about that as well. And thank you, Sam, for linking the ghostwork.info link in the chat. So the last part of our data pipeline is data use. And this is where I would say most of the scandals that make it into the headlines fall into is, okay, so the data has been collected, curated, processed. What are we actually doing with that data? And the first set of questions here revolves around what is called beneficence. And this is actually language that is directly used in IRB. And so the idea here is, how can we improve the lives of the people who are being represented in this data by using this data? And is it going to benefit those people or harm them? What are the benefits versus the risks? And there's a lot of examples where like people may have not consented to having their data used for something, and then that data is used to create some sort of algorithm or program or model that really actually actively harms them. And so that's an example of the opposite of beneficence. And then that's also an example of exploitation. And so another set of questions we can ask is, well, does this data use exploit or possibly manipulate people? And we see this quite a bit on social media with recommender systems specifically, and targeted advertising nowadays, where we are collecting data on people, and instead of using that data to augment and enrich their lives, that data is being used to exploit things like their insecurities. And then beyond exploitation and potential harm, we can also ask questions about control. Well, are we relieving all control from the users, or are we giving them any control in this process? Not only should they have the control to consent to data collection, but are we giving them control to modify misrepresentations of themselves, or maybe giving them the right to be forgotten? And so the idea with the right to be forgotten is that in the real world, let's say you make a small mistake, you can always move to a new city. That's pretty extreme, but you can also change your name. That's pretty extreme too. You can also just walk into a different part of town than you usually walk into, and people might not know you there. And there's this ability and affordance to be forgotten in the real world that we lose when we enter the digital world, because our digital footprint is often everlasting. And so maybe something that we said 10 years ago on social media is now being used against us. And there's no way for us to delete that information because maybe a screenshot was taken and we no longer own that screenshot. And so do users have the ability to control the way that they are being represented or possibly misrepresented online? Let's imagine a screenshot was taken that was curated, or a deep fake was created that isn't actually representative of who that person is. There's a lot of ethical implications here about our ability to control the data that we may or may not own about ourselves online. So now I'm going to move towards the foundational principles of data ethics, which I've categorized into 4 different categories here. There might be more, but most of the foundational principles fall into these 4 categories. And beginning with policy and regulation, a lot of what we can learn about data ethics stems from what I introduced earlier, the GDPR, and also the CCPA, which stands for the California Consumer Privacy Act, is basically the GDPR, but for California. So for the GDPR, maybe could I just get like a quick raise of hands for people who are very familiar with the GDPR? Like you've heard it a lot, you know all of the principles, you're maybe sick of hearing all the principles. Okay. I had a feeling there were going to be quite a few people in here, especially considering that you're all in Europe right now, or most of you probably are. Okay, cool. Then I'm just going to breeze through all of these, but also for those of you who are less familiar, like definitely this is worth looking up to go more in depth. The idea here is, so the GDPR stands for the General Data Protection Regulation, and it was released in 2016, and it is meant to protect data and privacy for residents of the EU and the European Economic Area. And so the 7 principles here are, well, first we have lawfulness, fairness, and transparency, which just means that the intended use or collection or processing of data needs to be disclosed clearly to subjects. And we also have purpose limitation, which means that data cannot be stored and repurposed for other means than what it was originally disclosed. So you cannot say you were going to use the data for one thing and then actually use it for another thing, like Cambridge Analytica did. And then we also have data minimization, which means do not collect data beyond what is absolutely necessary. You can't just collect people's social security numbers or their family history because you think that might be useful or interesting to use in the future. You need to actually have a specific use case of why you're going to use that data right now. And then accuracy, which a student yesterday informed me is also known as veracity. And so this is that the idea that the information that you collect on people needs to be correct and up to date. And so this also is in line with this right to be forgotten, that people have the right to be forgotten, and they also have the right to correct inaccuracies about themselves through the data that's collected about them online. And then we also have a storage limitation, which means that you need to tell people how long their data is going to be stored for, and you need to actually stick to what you say. So after you have informed people that you would no longer be storing their data, then you need to have good practices to delete and destroy that data. And this is also something that comes up a lot in IRB, that data is supposed to be destroyed when you're no longer using it. And then we have integrity and confidentiality, which means that data should only be accessible by people who require access to that data. And this is not just the general public, but this is true of data scientists as well. It actually wasn't until about the last 10 years or so that people within industry started critically questioning, should data scientists be allowed to see all of this sensitive information? Like, I personally know several data scientists at large companies who have told me, I have access to people's credit card information. Like, I have access to famous people's credit card information. And I am never asked as a data scientist. I mean, I'm trained to like not exploit or use that information, but I do have access to it. And I'd get fired if I used it, but I could use it. So yeah, integrity and confidentiality is also just trying to find better protocols and practices for the data scientists at a company to also have this like limitation to access and use and possibly exploit or harm someone through their data. And then finally, we have accountability, which is just that anyone handling data needs to be trained and aware of these principles in the GDPR. So there's a lot that we can learn from regulation like the GDPR. First of all, we can learn by being scared of getting fined, because a lower level GDPR violation can result in fines of up to $11 million or 2% of the company's annual revenue, whichever is greater. So for large tech companies, they do have a lot of money to lose on this, but at the end of the day, it's probably just a drop in the bucket. For mid-size or small size companies, if you get fined for a GDPR violation, this could be the end of the business. So it is a really big deal if you get caught for not complying with GDPR. And GDPR only applies to data that's being collected or used on residents of the EU. So the CCPA extended that to residents of California. But in practice, what actually happened was after the GDPR came out, this was such an important and like groundbreaking regulation, because since all these large tech companies were having to change their data practice infrastructure for EU residents, they figured we might as well just change it for all of our users anyway. Like, why have better privacy practices for half of our customers, but not the other half? So it did in effect end up like acting as this global regulation, even though it only actually is enforced for EU residents. And so other things that we can learn are getting things like a chief privacy officer or a data protection officer might be a great idea. And a data protection officer is actually required by the GDPR to have at an organization in order to be compliant. And that's somebody who basically just makes sure that all of the principles are being upheld. Chief privacy officer is not required, but is a great idea to try to instill values of things like privacy and the GDPR at an institution. And something else that I really want to mention here that I think is very important in this conversation about policy and regulation is that there is this tension between compliance and values that is definitely worth mentioning. And the example that I have here is when I was working at a tech company years ago, I was working with these colleagues who I personally knew were very passionate about data ethics and very passionate about privacy and personal data autonomy. And they were the kind of people who would have worked late at the end of the workday to try to help improve these things for users. And then the GDPR came out and it required them to do all of these tasks to become compliant. And they were complaining about having to now add to their to-do list all of these compliancy tasks for the GDPR. And I realized that, oh, wow, if they hadn't been told that this was a compliance thing, they would have actually loved to do this work on their own time because they do genuinely care about data privacy. But because they now think of it as, oh, I have to check this box for compliance, they no longer want to do it and they don't feel as passionately about it anymore. And so the nuance here is that a lot of people often think of data ethics as something that we have to comply to, and that, you know, the ethics people are forcing us to check all these boxes and they're adding work to our plate. But in reality, data ethics does not have to be about compliance at all. And it can actually be this really beautifully intrinsically motivated act that aligns with our personal values. And so an example of this is like, it can be really powerful if you're looking for a job to ask yourself, well, what are my values? What's important to me in my workplace? Do I want to work for someone who's willing to exploit other people's data? Do I want to work for someone who is willing to lie about their privacy practices so that they can make an extra buck? Is that something that I'm willing to ask in an interview if the organization has good data privacy practices or if they comply with the GDPR? So these are just important things to maybe consider before thinking about what job might be next. It's context dependent, and it depends on the person too, because for me, I've been in situations where I've been asked to do something in a job where I didn't feel comfortable doing that, and it felt like unethical to me. And I was an intern at the time, and so I didn't feel comfortable stepping up or saying anything. And so I just went along and did it. And I think a lot of people feel that power imbalance in jobs as well, where they're like, if I say anything, I might get fired. Or if I say anything, maybe I'll be left out of the conversation to contribute and possibly fix this in the future. So I just have to bear through. And for some people, maybe saying something and getting fired is okay because it aligned with their values. But for other people, if they're maybe on a work visa, saying something and getting fired could mean getting kicked out of the country. So it really just does depend on the context. And that's why also it's useful to think about this before taking on a job and trying to understand to the best of your ability if there are people who are doing data ethics work or who are passionate about these values before you take a job at all, so that you don't ever have to deal with that situation, ideally. But it's a tricky question. All right, so we're going to move forward to the next pillar here, which is fairness. And I'm also going to be as brief as I can on this slide because fairness is my area of research and I could talk about this all day, but fairness as it relates to things like the GDPR and data ethics has a lot to do with data use and how the way that we're using our data is or is not treating certain people or groups of people fairly. And this can also have to do with data collection as well. So one of the infamous examples is this gender shades study, where researchers back in 2018 discovered that different facial recognition softwares were not working well for anyone who did not have white skin. And they were really working far worse for women who had dark skin. And so the reason this was happening is because the training data was not reflective or representative of hardly any ethnicities or races beyond Caucasian. And one way that we could consider treating people more fairly through our data collection practices in this example would be, well, collect more diverse data. But it's not always as simple as that, because often when we say we'll collect more diverse data, this puts the onus of the data collection on the communities who are not being represented in the data set. And even more than that, there might be a reason why they choose to be excluded from the data set. Like, for example, in the United States, there's predictive policing softwares that are being used to predict where crime might happen. And because there is this like really, really long historical battle with racism in the United States, collecting more data on historical crime patterns to try to help make the system more accurate might actually just systemically amplify a lot of the horrible racist discrimination that happened in policing practices over the last several hundred years. So it's not always a simple answer. It's never a simple answer when it comes to fairness, but it is something that's important to critically question and think about with data ethics is, are our collection and use and curation and annotation processes actually fairly representing people and fairly treating people, not only just at an individual level, but also at a demographic group and population level? And then we have the concept of transparency, which is also a principle from the GDPR. And this is just that, people have a right to know. They have a right to know if data is being collected about them. They have a right to exercise control and agency. Once they have that knowledge, they have a right to be educated. And going back to this idea of like data ownership and whether or not we actually own the data that is being used or collected about us. Some people think genuinely that because we do own our data and because it is just an extension of us, if someone was to take that data without our knowledge and use it, it would be the equivalent of stealing someone's personal property in the real world, their tangible personal property. And so this also gets back to what I mentioned back when I was talking about Eric Schmidt in 2006 and saying cloud computing for the first time, or coining the term. This is sort of asking us to stop decoupling ourselves from this ephemeral cloud and to think, well, no, data is not this intangible thing that floats around us. Data exists on real servers in the real world, and those bits and bytes of data are actually just reflections of us, so they really are us. And so if we steal or manipulate or exploit or augment or amplify or do whatever with that data, it is directly impacting real humans to the point where if we steal that data, we are stealing someone's property. So it's a more extreme view, but it is something that could be considered when we think about like our data consent practices, for example. And the final little bit that I'll mention here is education is a really key component to transparency, because the more that you educate people and users about how their data is being collected and how it's being used, the more agency that they have to correct that data use or to make informed decisions based on accurate knowledge about that data use and collection practice, and instead of them having to just sort of make inferences and guesses about what might be happening. And it also fosters trust between people and their business, which I'll get to in just a moment. And so the final tenet here is privacy, which is probably what people think of first when they think of data ethics, but I'm getting to it last here. So privacy is this idea that information should not be publicly accessible, and public in this case could mean general users, or it could even mean the data scientists who are working with data. And a lot of people think that privacy might be this barrier to innovation, or maybe another compliance checkbox that has to be ticked. But I am of the mind that privacy is actually an opportunity to innovate, and it's an opportunity for data scientists and engineers and data workers to ask, well, how can we make this data private? This is a complex, fascinating challenge that we can attempt to solve as engineers. And some of the interesting ways that people have attempted to solve these challenges in recent years have been through practices like data encryption or data anonymization or differential privacy. And for those who haven't heard of differential privacy, this is a concept and more of like a methodology that was created by Apple back, I think around 2016, 2017. And the idea is that you add a bunch of noise to data that's really sensitive, so that when data scientists are working with data, they can still access it and use it to train models. But if they were to actually go into the data set itself and look at individual rows of data, they can't, for example, say, oh, this is this celebrity's credit card information, but they'll just see a bunch of noise in the data. So it's not really discernible to the human mind, but it is still available to use for a machine learning model, for example. And this also limits how much the data can be accessed by different data scientists within an institution, so that we're not accidentally exposing data more often than we should be if it is really sensitive and private. And so another important part of data ethics that is worth mentioning is that it is not something that also has to be antithetical to business incentives and interests as well. There is a business case to be made for data ethics. And this also goes back to the conversation we were just having about this difference between compliance and values. And so there are different there are different organizations who have started to implement what's called privacy by design. And this is just an approach that puts privacy and personal autonomy at the heart of every decision at an institution. And so data ethics work is a really good opportunity to assess for you all, what your values are with work, as I was saying before, but also for an organization to assess what their values are. And this can be in part with how they want data ethics to impact their work quality, but also how they want it to impact their organization and their relationships with users. And so for all of you, the way that data ethics could impact your work quality is it might give you an opportunity to make sure that your data practices are more private or secure or robust and protected against malicious hackers, for example. It also might give you an opportunity to create better data protocols and to avoid what's called ethical debt, which is very similar to technical debt. And we're going to get into ethical debt next week, actually, before the case study. And then on the organization itself, data ethics work can really positively impact not only the social responsibility and impact of the organization, but also its relationships with its users. And there's been a bunch of research on how data ethics can help increase user trust, loyalty, respect, dialogue between the system and themselves, and satisfaction. And all of these metrics are almost always directly correlated with revenue. And so doing data ethics work can actually address the bottom line. And we can say, if our users are more satisfied and they trust us more, they're going to come back. And if they come back, then we get more money. So the business case for data ethics really just is kind of a win-win all around. And now in the last little section of today's lecture, we're gonna go through some more case studies, because hopefully you all at this point do not need more motivation as to why data ethics work is important and possibly fascinating and something that can really be additive to whatever jobs you all already have or do end up having. But I personally just find case studies to be very fascinating, because I love seeing the ways that people have tried to do things well. And I don't love seeing it, but it's fascinating to see the ways that people have really not done well when it comes to data ethics. So we're going to go through a few different case studies, and also I'm going to have some open discussion and conversation with you all surrounding some of these case studies. So we're going to begin with some case studies on data privacy. The first example I have is what happened between Apple and the Pentagon back in 2016. So the story here is that in 2016 in San Bernardino, California, there was an active shooter who I believe was shooting at a mall. And while they were at the scene, they dropped their iPhone. And the FBI, when they were at the scene later that day, they recovered the iPhone. And they thought, well, this is perfect evidence in this case if we can get into this iPhone, but it was locked. And so everything was encrypted, and they were not able to get any information that they would need from the iPhone while it was encrypted. So FBI went to Apple and they said, hey, this iPhone is locked and we really need it for this important case. Can you unlock it for us? And Apple said, no, we don't do that. We actually care about privacy, and that's one of the core values of our company, and we can't be bullied even by the FBI into giving away someone's personal information, because we don't do that. We signed a contract with them. So this was a really important case study and a really important precedent that was set, because Apple was basically saying, we don't care who you are or what the context is, we will never unlock an iPhone for someone, no matter what, which really just sort of brings true the values that Apple has, but is also this interesting ethical gray area, because you, on the other hand, have the FBI who are trying to indict this murderer, right? Somebody who was shooting people with a gun. And so even though Apple was upholding their value, in this scenario, it was at what cost? So the next case study is also about privacy, and this was with the app called Strava. For those of you who haven't heard about Strava, this is a fitness tracking application where you can do different kinds of fitness activities, and then your activities will be tracked. And back in 2018, they came up with this heat map visualization part of their app, where whenever you would go on a run, for example, it would track where your run was. And then you could see, if you zoomed out, you could see like in your city where all the people's running routes were in this heat map, sort of like what you see on the slide here. And what happened was people were zooming out and looking all over the world to see other people's Strava heat maps in different cities. And someone noticed from the military, someone noticed that there was this big heat bubble in the middle of the ocean. And so they zoomed in and they were like, what is happening here? And it turns out that there's private military bases on these islands in the ocean that are definitely meant to be kept secret. They are very, very secretive, like high level security clearance. And just by zooming in on the Strava app, they were able to see all of these perfect grid lines that perfectly outlined all of the streets and like secret access points within this military base, because this is where the military personnel were going on their runs in the morning, and they were using the Strava app. And so Strava obviously was not intending to release this super secretive information to anyone in the world, but this was an unintended consequence of one of their design choices to try to make this public information that maybe should have been kept private in the first place. So both of those examples are really interesting, nuanced challenges with privacy. And I'm wondering what you all think should be required when it comes to privacy. Like if there's certain kinds of data that should be required to be private or public. And also, I'm very curious if you all think everyone deserves a right to privacy, because we have that interesting Apple case, right? Where it's like, did that person deserve a right to privacy in that scenario? Does everyone deserve a right to privacy? So yeah, I'm curious. This is an open discussion time, so feel free to like raise your hand and unmute, or just unmute if you have any thoughts to offer. The next set of questions that I have, or the next set of case studies that I have for you all are, actually, I'm just going to do two sets of case studies at once. So first, there's some cases on image data. And this first example is one that I already sort of gave anecdotally in one of the previous slides, this gender shades project. And on the slide, you can see a picture of Joy Bwalamwini, who is the founder of the founder of the Gender Shades Project, but also the Algorithmic Justice League. Oh my gosh, I'm kicking myself for not remembering that. Joy does some really amazing work. I would really highly suggest that you look up the Algorithmic Justice League. And this picture is actually an example of something that Joy did during the Gender Shades Project, where she noticed that these facial recognition softwares were not recognizing her face, but were recognizing her colleague's face who had lighter skin than she did. And so she put on this mask that you can see in the image, this like Phantom of the Opera mask. And all of a sudden the system recognized her face with this mask on, but not without it. And so she realized that this was not okay. And she conducted a bunch of really amazing research to help audit these systems to understand where these failures were happening and why. But then a part of this was also understanding that when it comes to facial recognition and classification, not only do these systems work worse for people with dark skin, but these systems are also more often than not used to systematically harm people with dark skin as opposed to people with light skin. And so there's this tension here where it's almost like, okay, if these systems are going to be used and deployed in society regardless, then maybe obviously we want to make sure that they are accurate equally amongst all people of all races and ethnicities. But if these systems are going to be used to systematically discriminate and continue discrimination against these groups, do we actually want them to be more accurate or not? Is it better or worse for them to be more accurate? And that's a fair question to ask. And there is no perfect answer there either. And the other example I have, which is sort of a tangential related, or not answer, the other case study I have, which is related, happened in 2015 from the Google Photos app. And some of you might have seen this scandal as well, where this couple was taking a photo on, I believe it was the woman's phone, and she was looking through this Google Photos app, and the app had just released this new feature where you could see in boxes like the ones on the slide, different photos that you had taken that were labeled to more easily access like certain categories of photos. And she and her boyfriend were categorized as gorillas by the app, which has a lot of implications about human rights and systemic racism and discrimination. And Google got a lot of flack for this, which, you know, they deserved. But it did ask a lot of questions about, well, how are these images being annotated in the first place? And how can we improve these systems to make sure that this never happens again? And so this instigated a lot of research to try to improve data annotation and labeling and categorization systems, especially for image classification and for facial classification. And then the last set of case studies I'll give here are on natural language processing, or NLP, and text data. So one example here is from what was called Taybot in 2016. Twitter released this bot that was named Tay. And their idea was that they wanted to do an experiment on conversational understanding. And so Microsoft said, the more that you chat with Tay, the smarter that it will get, because it learns to engage with people, and it learns through our conversational like phrasing and our mannerisms. And so people started chatting with Tay, and within 24 hours of being released on the Twitter platform, Tay started tweeting out racial slurs and really, really misogynistic content. And I think the famous quote when somebody was reporting on this was "flaming pile of garbage in, flaming pile of garbage out," because Tay basically just completely read and amplified systemic biases and trolling that happened on the internet. And since we're running low on time, I want to leave enough time for the final discussion here, which does not have to be specific to natural language processing, can just be specific to, you know, image classification, like we were just talking about, or privacy, or natural language processing. But I'm curious if any of you think any of these scandals could have been prevented. If so, how? Do you think it's possible to remove social biases from, let's just say, all data? And how can we evaluate if systems are biased? I'm also just curious, like general reflections about, you know, any of these case studies, any of the things we discussed today, like what is coming to mind when it comes to data ethics and these scandals? Feel free to share any of those things. Open discussion for the next, let's say, 3 minutes. I will be lecturing at you all for probably about 30 minutes or so today, and then the rest of the time is going to be spent on the case study, which I'll explain when we get to that section. So beginning with the ethics cycle, this is how to practically do data ethics work, or one of the many ways that we can practically do data ethics work. And this ethics cycle was created by people on the ethical intelligence team. It really closely resembles a lot of other cyclical frameworks that you might have seen in software engineering practices or software development practices, for example, and it involves 4 different steps. So there's safeguarding, evaluating, coming up with an action plan, and monitoring. And beginning with the safeguard step, you can think of this step as your product or your data pipeline's helmet. So this is something that will keep it safe over time. And the purpose of safeguarding is to try to get into this mindset of doing preventative data ethics rather than reactive data ethics. So this is sort of the moment where we begin to challenge Mark Zuckerberg's move fast and break things. And instead, we begin to critically question, should we be moving that fast? And is it worth breaking the things that we're breaking? Because maybe in the past, breaking things meant breaking a UX UI feature. But when we're talking about data ethics, often breaking things means harming real people or dealing with potentially negative consequences for real people. And you can come up with safeguards at every stage of the data pipeline. The purpose of these is to guard the system away from what's called ethical debt. So ethical debt, as I teased last week, is very similar to technical debt. For those of you who have worked on large code bases, you've probably heard this term before. So technical debt is what happens when you maybe make poor decisions in your coding infrastructure early on. So over time, those poor decisions accumulate and it leads to you eventually having to overhaul the entire system. And if you've ever worked with really archaic legacy code systems, you've probably learned that it's really a pain to have to overhaul the entire system and deal with code that wasn't written well. And so ethical debt is a similar concept, but it has to do with ethics rather than the technical methods that we use to create technology. And so ethical debt instead is what happens when we over time veer away from our values and we veer away from our ethical protocols and pipeline. And so those actions together compile over time and they result in us having to overhaul the system for ethics because maybe the system has now broken or maybe it's harming certain users. And this is when moving fast and breaking things is definitely leading towards some unethical actions and impacts on real people. And the less intense version of ethical debt is ethical drift, where we are subtly drifting away from our ethical decisions and values over time. And if ethical drift occurs too much, it will eventually lead to ethical debt. So the purpose of the safeguard is to figure out, well, where might ethical debt occur and infiltrate our system? And what we can do to try to surface these possible ethical debt places is to come up with a list of potential ethical risks for the system, and then to brainstorm what kind of safeguards might be necessary to protect the system from those kinds of ethical drifts. And once we've come up with a list of potential ethical issues, then we move on to the evaluate step. So evaluate, I can't give too much specific guidance on because this is highly context dependent. But basically what happens in the evaluate step is we come up with a method to test whether or not the ethical drifts that we have identified are occurring in the system already. And some tips that I have for all of you during this stage are to be specific about what you're evaluating. So for example, instead of saying, okay, I'm going to evaluate the data set, be very specific and say instead, maybe I'm evaluating how accurate our annotations are for our gender label of a subsample of our facial recognition data set. So be very specific about what the exact thing is that you're trying to evaluate and measure. And then also when you come up with a measure to actually conduct that evaluation, critically reflect on what that metric is actually telling you. I think it was Goodhart's law that said that when your metric becomes your target, it ceases to be a good measure, something along those lines. So this is a really good opportunity to ask yourself, is the metric that I'm using actually measuring the thing that I think it is measuring? Is it an accurate or appropriate proxy? And you might realize that some of the metrics that are most appropriate are quantitative, or some of them might be qualitative and require actually speaking to real users and real people and doing things like user studies or conducting interviews. So this is obviously going to depend on the context, but it is a good opportunity to really reflect before just jumping into evaluation. And then if you evaluate, and you determine that maybe some ethical drift has occurred or your evaluation results are not as you were expecting, then you need to come up with an action plan to try to improve the system from that ethical debt that you have uncovered. And so the goals of the action plan are to detect and solve the source of the problem. I'm going to say solve with air quotes, because often with ethical problems, there is no actual solution, as we learned last week, but maybe there is a way for us to begin to, at the very least, improve our ethical debt and align our system and our data pipeline with our values as an organization or as a company or wherever you're working. And then also the goal is to improve our evaluation results from the previous step of the cycle. And so what you begin to see here is that after you take action, you then evaluate again to see if that action improved your ethics. And then if it didn't, you take action again, and then you evaluate again until your evaluation results are telling you that ethical drift is no longer as bad as it was before, or that it is now within like reasonable grounds to deploy the system or to use the system on real users. So this is sort of an inner cycle that happens within the ethics cycle. And then once we feel good about the evaluation results, the practical work does not stop there. Then we move on to the final phase, which is monitoring. And so in the monitoring phase, you can think of this as sort of like the ethics version of continuous integration and development. So similarly, whenever we deploy code, we don't just ship it off into the digital world and then assume that nothing is ever going to break and it's perfect for the rest of forever. We also have to monitor our ethics interventions to make sure that they don't break over time, because people change, society changes, technology changes. And so that because of that, evaluation and action plans are not just one and done. And ethical drift can occur at really any time, which is why we must come up with a plan to continuously monitor when and if it might be happening. And different methods that you can use for this stage are to come up with a list of things that you want to make sure you're monitoring, and then recognizing that if you do actually need to make an update based off of something that's come back in your monitoring stage, then you will probably have to start from the beginning. And so hence the name, the ethics cycle, because we cycle back to the beginning, the safeguard step, and then we repeat the process again. So this is how we practically, or one of the many ways that we can practically do data ethics work. And there's many other ways to approach this kind of work, but this is sort of a clear-cut way that we can incorporate at every stage of the data pipeline, potential safeguards, ways to evaluate, and then ways to take action and do what are called ethics interventions. And now that we know how to do data ethics work, I'm going to describe the case study that we're going to all explore today to do that kind of data ethics work. And today's case study is going to be on ChatGPT, which I am assuming most of you have heard of at this point, but I just want to double check. Maybe let's see a raise of hands if you have heard of ChatGPT at this point. Okay, my assumptions appear to be mostly correct. It seems that perhaps half of you have not heard of ChatGPT, which means that it's either too early in the day to be using the raise hand feature, or maybe you just haven't heard of it, which is great, because then this will be all new to you. Maybe keep your hand raised if you've used ChatGPT. I'm curious how many in this Zoom room have actually interacted with it. Okay, it seems like maybe a quarter of you have actually interacted with it. Great. And some of you have not heard of it at all. Wonderful. Well, then for some of you, this will be a very quick crash course. And for some of you, this will be a nice refresher and maybe a good deep dive into the actual technology of ChatGPT. So I'm going to give a really brief timeline of ChatGPT technology, because this technology is incredibly hyped right now, as I'm sure many of you know. And it's fascinating because it's not new technology. Although ChatGPT itself is new, it's built off of what's called GPT models. And so GPT is this large language model that was built by OpenAI. And in 2018, OpenAI created the first version of this large language model, which is built off of a deep learning neural network that contains 117 million parameters. So it is a large, large model. And then in 2019, GPT-2 was created, and it is even larger than GPT-1. So at this point, GPT-2 now contains 1.5 billion parameters. And the data that is being used to train this model is coming from different places on the internet. And then fast forward to 2020, we have GPT-3 that was created, and now it contains 175 billion parameters and is also trained on a lot of internet data. And when GPT-3 came out, it was pretty groundbreaking technology for technologists that understood how large this language model was, but it wasn't really hyped up by the general public, in large part because people just didn't really understand what it was, and they didn't really understand its potential. So then fast forward to the end of last year, 2022, ChatGPT is created and released to the public. And ChatGPT is basically just a chat bot that's built off of the GPT-3 large language model. So ChatGPT itself actually is not really this crazy novel technological innovation. It's just a chat bot that's trained really well using things like reinforcement learning. But the actual technological innovation that's really amazing about ChatGPT is this GPT-3 language model. And so the reason why ChatGPT is so hyped is because it appears like it's this new, amazing, incredible technological innovation, when in reality, it's actually just a somewhat simple chatbot that is giving us the ability, or giving lay people the ability to interact and interface with this really, really incredible technology that is GPT-3. And now we are actually seeing the potential of this previously created technology that we just didn't realize was so fascinating before, because it was much harder to interface with it. So the purpose and goal of ChatGPT is to do what is called predicting the next token. So even though people are treating this chatbot sort of like a search engine, it is not in fact a search engine at all. It is just a predictive tool. And so the way that this language model works at a very high level, this is a crash course, so feel free to ask questions in the chat if I'm going too quickly or if you want to know some more specifics. But basically the idea is that with all of this data that the language model has taken in, that GPT-3 has taken in, it has now become really good at predicting what the next word is going to be in a sequence of words. So if we are to input into the algorithm, I went to the store blank, then it might predict that the next word is going to be today, based on all the times that it has seen a version of that sentence in the millions of different training examples that it's been given, or billions of different training examples that it's been given. So this is done through the creation of different probabilities of what word might be next, what sequence of words might be next, what sequence of sentences might be next. And over time, using what's called a transformer model, it has become really amazing at predicting the next word. So well, in fact, that it now passes the Turing test with flying colors. And it seems almost as if it is creating meaning from the sentences. It seems almost as if it's directly responding to questions that we prompt it with in this chatbot with real sources from the internet. But instead, it's actually just responding with probabilistic language math, basically. And so the chat part of ChatGPT, that is the new addition, is this extra layer of reinforcement learning that basically takes the inputs that humans have given to this chatbot and the outputs from the chatbot, and then uses real human annotators and labelers to assess those inputs and outputs and to label whether or not ChatGPT did well. And that is where the human has now entered the process to try to improve ChatGPT's ability to come up with better outputs based off of prompts given from real people. So that's your crash course on ChatGPT. And one of the things that is probably potentially one of the most important distinctions between ChatGPT and other technologies is that although people treat it like it's this search engine, it really is not. It is instead probably more closely aligned with what's called a stochastic parrot. And for those of you who have not ever read or heard of this academic paper on the dangers of stochastic parrots, can language models be too big? This is where that expression stochastic parrot comes from. This paper is very, very famous, but probably most famous for being the paper that got Timnit Gebru fired from Google. And in this paper, they warn against a lot of the ethical concerns and considerations of really large language models. And one of the things that is mentioned in this paper is that this idea of a stochastic parrot is that large language models and things like chatbots, they might speak to us in a way that sounds intelligible and sounds meaningful, but it actually isn't meaningful to the system itself. And so this is dangerous because a lot of people trust ChatGPT when they use it as if it is this sort of search engine that is responding to them with accurate information, when in reality, that is not the goal of the system at all. The goal of the system is not to produce factual, accurate responses. The goal of the system is to predict the most likely next word in a series of words. It's sort of like a parrot. So some important distinctions between ChatGPT and Google Search, for example, are on Google Search, if you ask a question, it will share information and responses to that question directly from primary sources. So it will give you the links to the web pages that it got those sources from. It allows you to use your own discretion to scroll through all the potential web pages that you could get answers to that question from and to make those decisions on your own. Whereas ChatGPT basically takes the aggregate of all of the possible answers to that question and then performs this probabilistic equation and algorithmic functioning, and then spits out sort of like the aggregate mean of all that information. And so some people have described this as sort of like a blurry JPEG of the Google search results that you might get from a question that you ask it. And because of this, it might actually spit out something that's just incorrect or wrong. Like I know that one of my PhD advisors, she asked it to do something like add 4 + 4, and it told her that the answer was 16, because it's not trained to be a calculator. It's trained to guess what the next word is going to be, and it guessed that the next word was going to be 16, and it just happened to be wrong that time, but sometimes it happens to be right. So people go on to ChatGPT hoping that it's going to give them correct and accurate results to their questions, because it often does, but it's not giving those correct results or responses to their questions because it was trained to do that. And the other important fact or feature of ChatGPT as well is that it does not include direct primary sources. So it will not tell you which source it got its response from, because it did not get it from a source. It got it from an aggregate of many sources. And it's an important distinction because since it does not actually act like a search feature, but it is treated like one, there's definitely some ethical implications. And despite it not being a search feature, people have been using it for some really interesting tasks of their own. And so some of the possibly most salient ways that people have been using ChatGPT have been to brainstorm and spark creativity in their own work. So a lot of people will maybe give ChatGPT a partially written essay and ask for brainstorming about ways to improve it or what to put next in their story. Or maybe they'll ask ChatGPT to come up with lyrics for a song that they're hoping to write. And they can also ask for things like editing assistance. Maybe they'll plug in something that they're writing and ask ChatGPT to give them feedback on how to make it sound better or to give it better tone in a specific style. It can also do things like tutor you on specific topics and to help make complex concepts more understandable to you. And I've even heard several people using it as a digital therapist, because since ChatGPT is so powerful, you can ask it to respond to your prompts in a specific style. And so some people have said, okay, can you please perform therapy on me in the style of cognitive behavioral therapy and answer this question, or give me support on this, or give me advice about this. So people are using it for many more things than just this, but this just gives you a little bit of a sneak peek. And unfortunately, it's not all good. A lot of people are also using ChatGPT for malicious intent. And a lot of the ways that it's being used for malicious intent is coming from this code completion feature that was added to ChatGPT. So not only can it answer your English prompts with English responses, but it can also answer if you ask a question saying, will you please write code for this kind of algorithm, then it will give actual code snippets for whatever you ask it to write. And people have been using that to write malware or to encrypt and decrypt things so that they can potentially conduct ransomware campaigns. And then apart from the code completion feature, a lot of students have been using ChatGPT to do their homework for them, where they'll just ask ChatGPT to answer the homework questions, and then they'll take the output from ChatGPT because it's written so well, and they'll just turn that in as their own homework, which is sort of raising questions about plagiarism and how we can still teach students and educate students in the same way as before, with this new technology sort of wreaking havoc on our ability to know whether or not students are actually doing their work or not. And there's a lot of interesting ethical concerns that are arising. And so some other ethical concerns that are arising are also in regards to the people who are doing the annotation work for this reinforcement learning layer. And so I believe it was a Times article that came out a few weeks ago that shed light on the fact that OpenAI was using Kenyan workers for less than $2 per hour to do content moderation and to make ChatGPT less toxic by labeling different toxic outputs from ChatGPT prompts and trying to improve the system. And so this was also like really emotionally exhaustive labor because they were having to look at really toxic, negative content all day long and then getting paid really poor salaries to do so. And then the final interesting ethical consideration and use case that we'll look at today is the OpenAI's use of what's called the filter. And this is referred to sometimes as the content moderation filter. People who are against it have referred to it as the woke filter, and people who are for it have referred to it as the ethics filter. And the idea here is, this is pulled from Wikipedia, but the purpose of this filter is to prevent offensive outputs from being presented and produced from ChatGPT. And so queries are filtered through OpenAI's company-wide moderation API, and potentially racist or sexist prompts are dismissed. So reasons why the filter is important and useful is because we don't want ChatGPT returning discriminatory, racist, sexist, biased results that could negatively impact people. So on this slide, you'll see some examples of real prompts that have been asked to ChatGPT and real responses using the code completion feature that it has. And these responses are all racist, sexist, ageist, and these are not even the worst ones that I've seen online. So obviously OpenAI does not want to be responsible for this kind of discrimination, and they have now started to filter a lot of their results. And so some people have noticed that certain results are being filtered in a way that describes why they're being filtered. And then in comparison to other chat bots, they actually are being over filtered in comparison. And so this is an example of how OpenAI is not willing to produce violent or gory content for someone. And then I also tried it myself a few days ago, and I asked OpenAI, or I asked ChatGPT if it could teach me to build a bomb. And it said, no, building bombs is illegal and can cause harm. And then I also saw this other example of someone who asked why men are better at throwing baseballs than women. And this is sort of when we begin to enter this interesting ethical gray area of this content moderation filter, because you can see that this response is clearly filtered because the filter is questioning the presumption that underlies this question. And it's questioning, okay, what does the word better mean? It's probably not good for us to just assume that men are better at throwing baseballs than women. But Some people have called this kind of filtering dishonest, or potentially coming from a woke mode, because they say that it does not allow us access to real factual information anymore, because there's a chance that it could be seen as discriminatory or biased. And so some people have successfully circumvented these filters. If you go on Reddit, you can see many threads about ideas that people have come up with and that have successfully worked to bypass these filters. And one person who bypassed the filter was able to see what the prompt would have been had it been unfiltered in response to this question: why are men better at throwing baseballs than women? And here's the example of a response that you might get from ChatGPT that is unfiltered, where it doesn't actually at a high level seem discriminatory against women. It seems like it is reporting on scientific information about why men's muscle mass is different than women's, for example. So we have sort of this tension that exists now, where this filter is obviously very beneficial, because without it, ChatGPT has the potential for existing already or for echoing already existing discrimination and power imbalances in society, which we do not want. But then alternatively, if we filter too much, then people might not get access to the information that they're looking to access. We might accidentally get, we might lose facts in the process of trying to filter. And some people have called this filter boring, and they've said that it is definitely not value neutral, but is actually very politically left-leaning and has started to anger a lot of users who don't align with those kinds of values. And so there's implications here, right? Because using this filter, it will prioritize and benefit certain stakeholders over others. And there are implications of being too, quote, woke. There are also implications of being, quote, not woke at all. So there, as is the case with these ethics problems, there is no correct answer. There is no perfect answer, but this could be something worth exploring further in your groups when we get into the case study. So speaking of the case study, I'm going to quickly go over the tasks at hand. And I want to sort of preface this task by saying that ChatGPT is a very important technology right now. It has 25 million daily users. And even though it only launched several months ago, it has had 619 million website visits since it launched. So OpenAI has a particularly vested interest in ensuring that the ethics of this technology are sound. And that is why you all today have been hired by OpenAI as an external ethics auditor for ChatGPT. And this does happen sometimes in industry, where external ethics auditors are brought in. I myself have been one before. So you all have now been given the task to try to uncover the most pressing data ethics issues, to come up with a plan to improve those issues, and to discuss the ethical trade-offs of your plan. And specifically, your instructions are as follows. So I recommend that you all begin by brainstorming your favorite or potentially the most important or pressing ethical data ethics issues that are involved with ChatGPT. And you can consider the entire data pipeline as a great way to spark your brainstorming. And try to think of things that will eventually lead to ethical drift or ethical debt. And then as a team, come up with an evaluation, an action, and a monitoring plan for one specific issue. So choose your favorite ethics, your favorite data ethics issue. And then you're going to make recommendations to OpenAI for next steps. And this is all very high level because you're only going to have 20 minutes to do this. So you can't get too in the weeds, but come up with like a high level idea or pipeline for how you might evaluate this issue and take action. And then if you have time at the end, try to think through some of the implications of the intervention that you come up with. Think about which stakeholders you are prioritizing with this action. Think about any unintended consequences that might happen from the plan that you come up with, and also discuss any ethical gray areas where there is no best solution, but a decision has to be made. And the goal here is that as a group, you will come up with one slide where you present this one slide to the rest of the class, and you'll have up to 5 minutes to present the information that you come up with. And you're presenting it to OpenAI's board of directors as this ethics intervention that you think that is most important for them to take first. And we are running towards the close of the session today, but I did want to quickly call out, congratulations. You are all now data ethicists. You have completed the data ethics crash course, and you can all now be entrusted to improve all of our technologies and our digital world and our data infrastructure, and can hopefully be a force of good for data ethics in the world. I guess I will leave us all with the final thought here, which is something that I like to share in any sort of like tech ethics workshop or lecture of any kind is, first, there's no right or wrong answer, as I've said many times, but there are ways to make informed solutions, or at the very least, informed approaches to trying to improve our technologies and make them better for people and for the world. And so all of you as budding data scientists or software engineers or data workers or tech workers of any kind, you are all about to be given immense power, and you might already have immense power in your job, in your career. And that is a really, really amazing opportunity to ask yourself how to wield that power responsibly. So fortunately, I'm excited that you are all the next generation of data ethicists and data workers, and you have this foundation and infrastructure now to do good, positive work through data, and to ensure that negative things are no longer perpetuated, or not perpetuated nearly as bad as they have been. And so with that, I just want to thank you all so much for being a part of this workshop series, and for being so attentive and present and discussing all of these sticky, difficult topics. This wouldn't be possible without you all, and good luck doing your data ethics work in the future. Thank you all.